As the caption indicates, this is part one of two videos on the causes of the First World War. At the end of this video, there'll be a link in YouTube that takes you directly to the next one, so please follow that. TeachersPayTeachers.com has the keynote attached, and I mention that in a second as well. And when we're teaching this, it's just always remember that when dealing with each of the different causes, it's always looking at why all that information encourages the nations to go to war. As I said, at the end of this, you'll be taken to a link to part 2. Thank you.
So these are the learning objectives, 3 of them going up in complexity. Just first of all, being able to describe main causes, short and long term, and then the ability to evaluate any links that exist between causes, and then finally to be able to judge the most significant cause or identify any linked cause. As I said, this is not going to look at the July crisis. Obviously, we know, and most people know, that it all got kicked off really with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip. But there's a lot before that leads up to this conflict, and there is a shorter video looking at the July crisis and those months that took us to war. But this is really looking at those causes that took us that far. Straight on into the main causes. As I said, use this as a teaching tool. I'll give you any tips. The last slide you just looked at was like a walkabout, talkabout, so you could just post up some blank sheets around the room and get kids to articulate what they know already, because they'll know a lot already. There's 2 kind of good essay titles here, discussing the part played in the outbreak of the First World War by 2 states, excluding Germany. Most students like to jump in with Germany, so this is good. It makes them think a little bit. And then to what extent was militarism the most significant cause of World War I? Again, encouraging students to think not only militarism, but the other factors, and really do a good piece of analysis and balance on that. So I like to always do a good activity to start, and what makes a country a great power is a good exercise, because it gets kids thinking about those powerful nations that took us into the first. These are the main causes we're looking at: militarism, industrialization, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. I hope to do this all within about 10 minutes. Let's look at first and jump into that. The main alliance system is very familiar. We will be looking at the Balkans later, but the main one, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, France, Great Britain, and Italy, form those 2 big alliance blocks. And if we look at some of the background to the nations, often students don't know that Germany becomes a nation in 1871, and Bismarck wants to expand. Why? Proud country, has a proud history. Germany, although it was a kind of a series of monarchies and states, was very proud, very strong, and they wanted to expand to match the likes of Britain and those other countries who were imperialistic and expanding. So he starts building alliances, pledging military support around the world, and a real aim to isolate the French. The relationship between Germany and France has been tough for many years. Germany has a relationship with Russia through financial means from 1887 in the Reinsurance Treaty. It's all around loans and money and support, and they lose that relationship with Russia after refusing to give her loans in 1890. That gives Germany a bit of a problem, because obviously France is to the west and Russia is to the east, so potential there for a war. Russia is isolated. They don't like being isolated, but they are, and they gain support from Germany in loans, and then the French jump in with loans after that. France again are isolated, and again don't like being isolated. Not the strongest military in the world, and they want friendships to support them, particularly with the relationship they have with Germany. And they have no natural friendships, which is us to Britain. Britain loved being in isolation, and even had the term splendid isolation. Britain would come out of it when it suited her. Had a massive empire, but they just had a failed Boer War experience in Africa, where it started to become obvious that their military or their tactics maybe weren't appropriate, or their technology wasn't where it should be. They started the naval race with Germany, with the dreadnoughts, as we'll come on to, and there was tension in Africa with France, particularly as other countries started the scramble for Africa. This is a very common picture of the alliance systems, the triple entente of Russia, France, and Britain. Entente is obviously a French word, so that's how I always remember that France, isn't it? France, Britain, and Russia make up that. And then the triple alliance of Italy, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. You can see in the middle there is the Balkans, and we're going to come on to that. But the 2 big alliance systems are the Entente and the triple alliance. And this is what Europe looks like in 1914. So you can see the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy smack bang in the middle of Russia, France, and England. So just from a militaristic point of view, you can see that the German, Austria-Hungary, Italian alliance there is really surrounded. So without knowing anything more than that, there's a disadvantage to that. And there's a strength, obviously, by being surrounded, but by having the strength in the centre there, but having to fight wars on two fronts is difficult. And then you throw into the mix the whole Balkan situation there, it becomes even more complex. So there are your two alliances. And why would alliances lead to war? It's always good to ask that question, particularly when you're answering a question about what factor led to war. So you have to look at why. An alliance is about suspicion, secrecy. They're hard to maintain. There's a tension there. If one person fights and they have to call in their buddies. And historians Robert Roswell Palmer and Joel Colton said it would have taken the most Olympian of statesmanship to have actually avoided war. It was almost too much effort or too hard not to have a war in this. So that's how alliances led to it, that kind of increasing tension between the countries, the fact that if any one of them had had a problem with each other, they would have jumped in. Let's move on to militarism now. Militarism factor in a breakout of war for obvious reasons. And at the turn of the century, the 19th and 20th, major European powers had the largest armies in history. Statesmen believed that this would avoid war through deterrence. You can see today with the whole the mutually assured destruction idea that if you have significant weapons on both sides, then war would be avoided. I would argue that maybe that works with nuclear weapons because it's going to lead to destruction of significant infrastructure, if not the world. I don't know if that works with a smaller kind of weapons of destruction, such as cannons and machine guns, or even they were developing. They weren't even an issue in the First World War. So I don't know if it was a good smart move, but they felt that deterrence would avoid war. A good exercise for kids is: do you think this would agree? Do you think this would actually work? And is it a dangerous game? And what could happen? And again, this growth of military creates fear, mistrust, and also preemptive strikes. So a smaller country that's getting outgrown might strike early. Huge armies, how do they come about? Besides Great Britain, the armies were fed by conscription of up to between 2 and 7 years. That's the amount of time they'd have to spend for men of age. France passed a 3-year law, which increased from 2 years, so soldiers had to serve for 3 years. And the Russian army was the largest in the world, with 1.3 million, with a reserve that some suggest about 5 million and growing. So huge armies. But there's a big, and that's called mobilization. Mobilization is how quickly it takes an army to actually get to a battlefield, and unless you have good infrastructure, good industrial means like railroads that can quickly transport weapons and people and soldiers and food and resources to the front line, it actually doesn't matter how big your army is. So particularly with the Russians here, their mobilization strategy was not good. So when we're looking at size of armies, you always have to remember how quickly could they have mobilized. And if it's right in the middle of Europe, Germany's going to have an easy job of mobilizing because that's where the battlefields would have been formed. Militarism, this whole, why is this a factor for war? Well, the armies were increasing and navies were increasing, so it just makes everyone feel a little bit tense. The technology used by countries developed significantly and the industrial methods improved, so guns became better. Before this, the joke is, mainly wars were fought on horseback with swords. So now we're talking about weapons that can kill in vast numbers and quickly. Krupp and Skoda factories became big industrial heartlands and producing machine guns that could fire 400 to 500 rounds per minute. These are killing machines. And that's the equivalent of 80 rifles. So the game's changing, and with cannons as well, these weapons of war and death are becoming much more productive, if you like. And of course, the big one is the dreadnoughts, the Battle of the Dreadnoughts. Began between Britain and Germany, and it became hugely contentious and created huge friction between both nations. In 1906, Britain launched the first dreadnought, and it basically meant that all others were redundant because it had this awesome firepower. The HMS Dreadnought, 17,900 tons, 526 feet, 12-inch guns, 18 4-inch guns, torpedoes. This was a game changer. It completely changed the shape of the war in terms of the Navy. And you can just see, if you look at the tables, how the two countries were going backwards and forwards. And this, just the fact there was a race between building weapons of war creates tension, because why else would you build something unless you're going to use it? So both countries realized that in building this, they were probably going to create something that meant they had to go to war, increasing tension and increasing the problem between Germany and Britain. And you can see here, this is a great table to look at the balance of power in 1914, where things were, the number of soldiers, warships, submarines. And it's a great exercise to get students at this point just to rank the countries, like who should win on paper. Looking at this, who should win this war? Great exercise, great statistics, and it also gives students some statistical evidence to use in essays.
That brings you to the end of part one. As I mentioned earlier, the resources on teacherspayteachers.com. My username is resources for learning, and that's for the numerical force, so resources for learning, and it's all free on there, so feel free to download it. Thanks. Welcome back to part two. As I mentioned, teacherspayteachers.com, the keynote for this is there. Resources for learning with for numerical is my username, and you can download this keynote for free. Thanks.
Moving on now to look at industrialization. Obviously, we've looked at militarism in the alliance system, so let's focus on industrialization now. Historians equate like economic power to military powers, and the more money you have, the more strong economic power base, then the stronger military you're going to have. Some would say it's a far more complex. The relationship is important, but other factors contribute to creating a great power. So one says that the economy is important, the other says it's actually a lot more complex than that. And I would agree that it is complex, depending on what the country's outlook is and if they have imperialistic aims, etc. But they both, economic power for sure does allow military to grow. As things are not disputed, the latter part of the 19th century witnessed massive industrial output. It changed completely. It started in England in 1760 approximately, so England had a real step on the ladder in terms of industrialization. But by 1870, it had spread through Europe and to the USA. And by 1914, Europe was significantly more industrialized than it had been in 1880. This means that you can produce more ships, you can produce more weapons more quickly, and it really does form, although it kind of like created on a different means, it allowed for weapons of war to be created quickly, and Britain certainly had the increasing industrial output equals wars starting. It's a great discussion topic. Does the increasing industrial output of the country means a war is likely to start? It depends. It depends on if you lead a discussion in your classroom or whatever you want to do. It's a good debate topic. How does increasing manufacturing lead to conflict? Well, basically, it just means that weapons are more readily available and they can be produced quicker and they can be more efficient. Another reason for potential for conflict is just looking as a country. If you look at a country who is increasing their production by 124% or 250% while you're doing 18%, you want to ask that question, why? For what reason are they doing it? And does that make you suspicious? Does it make you nervous? What are they producing? Is it weapons? Is it food? Or is it machinery? What is it they're producing? The potential for conflict is when mistrust happens. If some country starts outperforming or outproducing, another country is going to ask questions and want to know why, and that could cause conflict. Good activity now of power ranking. We did it earlier. You should have done it earlier with that slide that looked at where countries are in the world. Now, using the next image, it's a great image that you can start looking at industrialization and war and power. So now creating from this a ranking thing about which country is in the best position based on this information to go to war. So the disparities we're starting to see in terms of who's producing what and how quickly and how far led swiftly to economic tension between the powers. This led to political and diplomatic tension. So this disparity between industrialization, the amount of money being made, the amount of weapons, the amount of metal, the amount of ships, lead to political and diplomatic tension between these big countries, particularly Germany, Britain, France, Russia, particularly Austria-Hungary is starting to look at it as well. But what we have to look at is to get this industrialization working, you have to look at what's required to power. And this is where we start looking towards Africa. So the need for resources led to a neo-mercantilism mindset in the late 19th century. Self-sufficiency, decreasing imports, and a rush to acquire more colonies because of the increased need for the resources from those colonies. Okay, and that increased need for their colony to act as a marketplace. So these European countries realized that colonies were not only cool to have, but also awesome for making money. And particularly, these colonies had natural resources. Thus leads the scramble for Africa. The scramble for Africa had for the longest time solved the problem of natural resources. They'd been easily used, they could be taken up to Britain or wherever and used. Problem was, in 1900 the well went pretty much dry, and new resources had to be found and taken. And you can see here, colonies, therefore, had to be taken or wrestled from other countries by force or by diplomacy. So you had a fairly solid picture of imperialism and empires, that Britain owned most of it, France had some, but Germany is moving into this new world stage where it's a country now and wants some of the power, wants some of the wealth, wants to be able to build its industrial heartland, but needs these resources. So now starts to look to these. Trade had also increased at this point. By 1913, Germany's exports had equaled that of Britain. It's growing as a power. It's becoming mature. Germans outsold British and US markets. To protect this, Germany now needs this powerful navy, hence the dreadnoughts. So the connection between economic rivalry and military rivalry is now starting, and between Germany and Britain. Okay, we're going to now look at another cause, imperialism and nationalism, and some definitions here. The nation is a small group of people who share a number of commonalities: language, culture, territory, historic culture. Nationalism is a more emotional attachment to the territory and a desire for political independence. And imperialism is a set of actions and policies by which one national group dominates another group and its territory. So imperialism was very much a British policy for the longest time, going out and taking India, taking big parts of Africa, etc. Causes tension. The scramble for Africa obviously increased imperial tension. Until 1850, exploration was limited to the coast. So it was on those coastal towns. However, Henry Stanley changed that and looked inwards for the economic gains. If you look at somewhere like the Congo, for example, with its rich plutonium fields and its diamonds, those countries became very, very interesting to us. Looking to Germany now, Otto von Bismarck was in power from 1860 to 19. He was replaced by Wilhelm, 1888 to 1918, and Wilhelm really changed the game, much more aggressive as a leader. Bismarck wasn't so much interested in war and power, Wilhelm was. And in fact, if you look at Bismarck, he had a disdain for colonies. He realized that Scramble Africa would only cause a war. He hosted a conference in 1885 in Berlin to establish rules for colonization. He didn't want colonies for Germany, but he also didn't want another European war because powers are fighting amongst themselves. Bismarck, when he retires in 1819, replaced by Wilhelm, and Wilhelm was insulted, and he felt that Germany was underrepresented on the world stage. The young Wilhelm demanded expansion and Germany's place in the sun. This is causing tension. So he wants bits of Africa, and who's he going to take it from? Britain, France, those countries. He developed something called a Westpolitik, or a world policy, and whilst visiting French-controlled Morocco at an international conference, he proclaimed the status of Morocco should be re-evaluated. This action only upheld French claims, strengthened Anglo-French relationships, but the rest of Europe became wary of Germany as this power that's starting to emerge and take. The Germany sent the gunboat Panther to Moroccan port Agadir. The UK unequivocally supported France. Wilhelm left the region feeling dangerously isolated. So Germany steps into the waters, Britain shuts it down, supporting France, reinforcing this idea of a partnership. Now to show off this kind of idea of cause of war with nationalism. And we're going to look at the Balkans and Austria. And these maps are kind of important to working out that area. So we're looking at, from Macedonia, and you can see in the middle here, to all the different places that make up the Balkan area. You can see Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, Montenegro, etc. And when I'm doing this, please refer back to maps or print maps off. It's a good way of doing it as an exercise or a teacher. The region is populated by a number of ethnic groups. Ethnic groups were broadly referred to as Slavs, and they're centered in the small independent nation state of Serbia. Politically, domination of this area was split between two rival empires: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was right next to Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, which split into North Africa, and moving up to the east of Austro-Hungary. At the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is crumbling. And Austro-Hungary has a desire to expand her influence in the region. So it's a very unstable part of the European political system, and key, really, because of its position. The flux in the region reawakened age-old Balkan aspirations for Russia. There were growing numbers of radical Pan-Slavic, which the Pan-Slavic movement is for the unity of all Slavs, living under the Habsburgs, which is an Austrian empire. So they wanted a future not under Austro-Hungarian rule, but under a greater Serbia. So they're wanting to break away from Austria-Hungary, who's starting to want a bigger empire. So Austria-Hungary, a smaller player maybe in the big names of Europe, but starting to stretch its muscles, seeing the decline of the Ottoman Empire. But trouble is, we have nationalism re-emerging in Serbia. Added to this was the Serbians' desire to become a dominant state who was leading the drive for a pan-Slavic. The region is volatilely so. In 1911, Italy tries to take Tripoli from the Ottomans by force. Serbia sees this as an opportunity because the Ottomans are distracted, so they're not looking. They're going down to try and figure out the whole Italian problem. At this point, they create the Balkan League, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece, and they go to war with Turkey, which is kind of like the heartland of the Ottoman Empire. They won Albania and Macedonia, but most of this went to Bulgaria. Serbia fixes this. Obviously, their desire for power is strong in the Second Bulgarian War in 9. Serbia now wants Albania because it has access to the sea. If you look at the map, Albania gets good access to the sea. They were stopped by international action led by Austria-Hungary. Russia supported Serbian claims. Russia backed down as Austria-Hungary would not give up. Russia has also backed down from Austria in 1908 over Bosnia. The trouble with this is now Russia's backed down twice and is becoming a little embarrassed, and the country is becoming a little embarrassed by its inability to stand up to people. The result was the independent kingdom of Albania of all this action. The main result, though, is Austro-Hungarian Empire determined to stop pan-Slavic nationalistic claims, so real tension growing there in the region. And the emboldened Serbia is determined to expand. The Russian Empire is twice humiliated and determined to express her power. So you've got a humiliated Russia, you've got an emboldened Serbia who wants nationalism, and you've got Austro-Hungarian Empire determined to stop them. So you've got this bubbling tension in the region, which creates and leads to World War I. Great activity is to do a brainstorm or a mind map of how all of these factors combine together, and getting students to form those links, the obvious links, that like how the economy links to militarism, etc. The next video will look at the July crisis and how all of this bubbles into that month of kind of actions that led us into the inevitability of the First World War. As I said, all of this is on Teachers Pay Teachers. It's a free resource, and it's for Resources for Learning 4 with the number 4.